Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, presented to you by the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate at the Combined Arms Center at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The views expressed here are those of the individual and do not represent the views of the Combined Arms Center, U.S. Army, or U.S. government.
Welcome to Breaking Doctrine, a U.S. Army Combined Arms Center podcast on our Army's doctrine and vision of warfare. I'm Captain Scott Jones, and today we're going to talk about one of my absolute favorite things in the Army, leadership. It's one of the world's most popular nonfiction topics. Leadership books on Amazon number at over 60,000 books on offer with the word leadership in the title. Leadership is a practice that is constantly evolving, and thankfully we have doctrinal guidance about leadership within the Army provided by ADP 6-22, Army Leadership in the Profession, and the newly released FM 622, Developing Leaders. Ever a popular title, FM 622 routinely finds itself as one of the top 25 books downloaded from the Army Publishing Directorate's website. And since we're discussing such a popular doctrinal publication with broad and varied opinions, it helps to have the lead for the organization responsible for FM 622 and the author of the book on hand. Colonel Saine, the director for the Center of Army Profession and Leadership, also known as CAPL, and the former commander of 2nd Battalion, 18th Field Artillery, and the 4th Battlefield Coordination Detachment, joins us today. Sir, welcome to the show.
Good afternoon, Scott. Great to be here with you and the team.
We also have the amazing Mrs. Judy Price, a retired Army engineer and author of the new FM 622 with us today. Ma'am, welcome to the show.
Scott, it's a pleasure to be with you this afternoon.
And finally, it wouldn't be Breaking Doctrine without the director of the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, retired Colonel, Mr. Rich Creed. Sir, welcome to the podcast.
Hey, good to be here, Scott. Thanks.
So, before we dive into the book, I think it's good to put CAD and CAPL in context with one another and with the wider Army. It may help some of us to understand a little more about the mission of CAPL and some of the organization's recent initiatives. Sir, Colonel Saine, can you tell us more about the Center for the Army Profession and Leadership?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. I'd be happy to. The Center for the Army Profession and Leadership, or CAPL, is an outcome of combining two organizations. The Center for Army Leadership, or CAL, that had been around in the Army since 1984 when it was established, and the Center for the Army Profession and Ethic, or CAPE, which used to be located at the United States Military Academy West Point. They were merged into one organization here at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas in April of 2019. And so there's really a combined mission. But that mission really for the Army is to conduct studies, develop doctrine and products, and provide services to strengthen the Army profession and improve leadership and leader development across the force. And that's really done primarily at the direct and organizational level. That's where we focus our time, think kind of brigade, battalion level and below. And that's all focused to try to improve climates and leader effectiveness, which really leads to more mission-ready units, or the preparedness of those leaders to perform operations. CAPL itself is a director within the Mission Command Center of Excellence and CAC. And again, in support of that mission, CAPL's a responsible, a contributor in a number of things that some of your listeners may already be familiar with. Like you mentioned, our leadership doctrine, or ADP 622, and the FM, which we're going to talk about here shortly. We do provide support to the School of Command Prep or the pre-command course when folks come through that. And then we also conduct assessments and develop them and collect peer and subordinate feedback that is used in support of the command assessment program. So that's how the Army has really transformed or evolved the selection of 05 and 06 level commanders and key leaders, as well as brigade command sergeant majors. CAPL also develops those how-to products, and those are things you can find on our website, so www.CAPL. Guarantee, I wish I'd have known CAPL or CAL existed before I would have had the opportunity to command. Great products and great tools, and then also some folks you can reach out to. One of those programs that CAPL started at the behest of the then CG CAC, then Lieutenant General Rainey in 2020, was called Project Athena. Project Athena is really a part of the larger cornucopia of career-long assessments. So career-long assessments, Athena is really a more accurate name now. But Athena is a Chief of Staff of the Army initiative that provides leaders feedback on their skills, capabilities, and tendencies That's all intended to help them improve their self-awareness, or become more self-aware. What are their strengths? What are their developmental needs? Where could they best spend their time to be more effective as a leader as they adjust their behaviors to lead, communicate, think, and interact with others? And primarily that's their formations and other leaders that they work with. As leaders are more self-aware, they put forth the effort to improve. And we're going to talk about that, I think, later, which is that self-development domain of leader development, one of those three pillars of leader development. The program itself, it starts in resident PME, and it's supported by a battery of what's called as developmental assessments. This is all additive to the curriculum that each of our commandants and branch chiefs is responsible for in each of our schools. And this includes our officers, our non-commissioned officers, warrant officers, and our Army civilians. But what it does is it provides individuals a feedback on their performance or their responses to each of those assessments. That feedback is structured in really three areas: leadership, cognitive, and those personal aspects. But everything, and this is why it's so important today in this discussion with the ADP 622 and the FM 622, is it's all grounded, like the Command Assessment Program, in the leadership requirements model. Those competencies and attributes contained in those documents define or show us all how we should behave, and that's regardless of whether we're a young private or we're an old colonel like myself. Those competency and attributes guide our behaviors, our treatment of other people, and our leadership inside the formations. That LRM, or that leadership requirements model, also grounds our evaluations. If you look at your officer evaluation report or non-commissioned officer evaluation report, those competencies and attributes help to frame the feedback on an individual's performance that's being given. But again, all this is really important, that we learn about ourselves, our strengths and developmental needs, but the key is really doing something about it. So what is the tool to move forward as an individual graduates from resident PME, takes these assessments, performs, learns more about their branch or MOS skills in PME, and that tool is already a part of our counseling process, and that's an individual development plan, or IDP. That has been revised as a part of this new FM 622, and is now a DA form 7906. And what that IDP or an IDP does, or is a plan for a leader to address what they've uncovered as developmental needs. And then to establish some goals, as well as overlay some of their personal, professional, and maybe family goals to come up with a plan on how they can improve, how they can move forward and become the best version of themselves. So again, hopefully that helps a little, Scott, but really great to be here and get to share with the team.
Yeah, that was a really fantastic overview of CAPL and some of those initiatives that you have going on, like Project Athena. So I would like to switch gears for a moment and take a look at the history of the Army's Leadership Field Manual. So we're going to stretch all the way back to 1946, when we had FM 22-5, which was Leadership Courtesy and Drill, which came out shortly after World War II. It kind of evolved from there, and we had Training Circular 6 and DAPM 22-1. And between those three documents, the Army kind of established responsibilities, the qualities they expect from leaders, and a lot of the principles. There was 10 that they were identifying in particular. It continued to evolve from 1951. We changed the title to FM 22-100, which then was actually titled Leadership. In 1983, we also then saw the new framework or concept come into being called Be, Know, Do. And in 1999, that became the subtitle for the manual. So we keep talking about Be, Know, Do, and I really appreciate Be, Know, Do. And we keep mentioning it over and over again. And it really piques my interest because when I joined the Army, that was the leadership framework that we operated on. So I really want to know, for our audience, what brought about the return to that leadership requirements model, and how has it changed since that 1999 framework?
Okay, that's a really good question, Scott. But one, I want to make something clear that the LRM was first published in 2006. So the model you referred to in 1999 as the Be, Know, Do model is completely different than what we use for the LRM now. So as part of that, what was retained from the model were the Army values, because those debuted in that 1999 manual. And then we brought back Be, Know, Do. It was not officially part of the LRM until the 2019 ADP 622 publication. So it was sort of an informal tagline, if you will. It was the tagline that wouldn't die, because it resonated with everyone. So that was why we kept the tagline and brought it back. But the actual model itself, there were problems. It was inconsistent. It was conflated. It was confusing because it didn't have cohesion, and there were overlapping things between skills and actions. So there were things that you could do, but we didn't need the duplication. So as part of that process leading after 1999, there was the evolution of the Army Training and Leader Development Panel, and it was an extensive look into Army culture and leader training. And it ran from 2000 to 2003. And then after that outcome of that panel, there were a series of white papers and technical reports that kind of went through the history of our leadership doctrine to come out with what model do we want to have, as an enduring framework for all of our leadership. And that's how we got the LRM for today. One of the other things that came out of the ATLDP is a process that we call CASL. So it's currently the CAPL annual study of Army leadership. It started in 2005. And it's going to be important because I use that as part of my research process to update ongoing leadership doctrine. And so the LRM has been the standard framework since 2006, and we've only made minor changes and additions since then.
Great. And hey, Judy, really thanks for that. And again, I think it's important as we take a look back at our leadership doctrine, it's really to frame where we are today. And so we've talked about a couple of those documents, the ADP 622 and the FM 622, but I think it's important we all understand what the purpose of those documents are. And so for a lot of our listeners, that this is pretty self-evident. But our ADP really shows us what right looks like in terms of leadership and those associated behaviors. And that's that LRM that Judy talked about, those competencies and attributes. What the FM does is it complements it, and it helps us to guide how we can develop ourselves. We could do a self-assessment by digging into each of those competency attributes, but also how we can better support and develop other leaders. As they understand more about themselves just like ourselves, there's things we're good at and there's things we're not as good at. And spending time on those things that are important that we're not as good at is how we can move that needle in terms of our own personal leadership effectiveness, just like we can with those we work with and those we work around in our overall teams. The LRM serves as the basis for some other activities, and so I talked about a couple of those before. So it's important that we all understand that those competencies and attributes, like I said, frame how we should behave and what that looks like. And so that's why it's a part of the developmental assessments in the PME experience. That's designed to help folks supercharge and then connect with some resources, improving their leadership. The command assessment program is purely talent management. There's some feedback that each participant or candidate gets and receives for their own self-development, but it's really to help the Army make a more informed decision about where our lieutenant colonels and colonels, which lieutenant colonel and colonels should lead at that level, as well as our brigade command sergeant majors. And then finally, like I said before, it is the framework for our evaluations. It's the lens we should be looking through to help ourselves get better, the folks we work with get better, but also to evaluate that performance. So again, Judy, I don't know, any thoughts from you?
I don't have anything to add to that.
I do. So that leadership requirements model, I think over time it's become more structured and formal. And so the be, no, do, I grew up in a be, no, do Army, right? But the be, no, do piece, well, officers were expected to, that was really an NCO model. That was linked very specifically to the non-commissioned officers' creed and those kinds of things. With the I'm going to show you how to do things, and then I'm going to embody that during the execution of whatever it is that we're doing. And so it's walking the walk kind of mentality. So that informal relatability to a large part of the force, I think, is the appeal, right? So the science that goes into the development of leaders or developing leaders is one thing, but the manifestation for it, generally, we're not burying people under science. We're providing tools and structure to get after that without, saying we have to explain how everything works. You really want to give something that sticks in people's head. And I think the other piece, when you ran through the history of the leadership doctrine, I find it fascinating that when we had a conscript army in the Second World War and we struggled over leaders basically learning on the job in combat in many cases. It took us a while to figure out that maybe we need to do something a little bit better on that. And as our armies become more professional, I think our leadership doctrine has become more structured as well. And I don't know whether it's a chicken and an egg thing or not, as we've had a professional force for 50 years now.
Yeah, and Rich, I think some great points there, and I think you're that's one of the things that, as we all know, that makes our force so powerful, and that's that all-volunteer force. It's that professionalism and that desire through and that goal through our leadership development of moving people from compliance-based leadership to commitment. And that commitment is so critical, as we all know, especially when we're put into situations and scenarios, generally somewhere other than the CONUS United States, that is going to challenge what is instinctively inside us for our own safety or the safety of our others. So I think absolutely that comes hand in hand, I think, with that professional approach that we have grown more and more, and that all-volunteer force.
Well, I think that's part of the beauty of the relationship between the Center for Army Profession and Leadership and the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, in that you guys review our other doctrine. And that helps you remember what we're developing leaders to do. And it helps us make sure that we're keeping abreast of the terminology, but more importantly, the methodology, I think, for developing people to do the types of operations that doctrine describes.
Okay, so I think I want us to stick with the history piece we've been talking about and kind of see what other common themes did you see in the history of Army leadership manuals as you were creating the new FM 622?
Well, part of it we've talked about, the definition really sort of hasn't changed. Leadership is influence, how you work with your soldiers. But overall, like for me, going back and learning that whole lineage, it was going and doing the research. But really what I do now is I take all of the research we have out there and kind of make that usable for the general soldier, general leader. But I look on Army research. So the focus there is I get feedback and input from Army leaders across the force. But we also get feedback through our CAPL, I mentioned it earlier, and that is important because it's a representative sample and it also includes civilians, so it's not just our military, and that's one of the things that's unique about the 622 series is that it is both military and civilian application. But we also read CTC studies, what's going on with the validation studies, and then senior leader topics that are of interest. Sometimes it's like, I want to know more about this, and it's like, okay, we don't really cover it. Do we need to cover it? Is it something we need to address in doctrine first? Or is it just something we need to provide handbooks or some other product? So we take all of that, and then, of course, whatever contemporary leadership research is out there from journals and conferences. So we pull it from a wide base of places, but really the focus is on those Army leaders and getting feedback from our people, because we know that's what works.
And I think Judy brings up a great point that, listen, I'll be honest, I didn't fully have a full appreciation or understanding that, all of our doctrine in terms of our leadership is grounded in research and studies. It's grounded in feedback from leaders and soldiers throughout our formations. It's grounded in history. It's grounded in what we learned from the civilian sector. Although not all of it's the same or applicable, it's all important that we understand this human experience we all have while we're on this big round ball. And because it's all about providing that purpose, direction, and motivation to our soldiers, to other leaders, and to our formations. And again, the ADP and the FM helps us to understand better what right looks like, but not just because what right looks like because that's what the science and research says, but it's because that science and research tells us that that's what's going to help us achieve mission success. And that's what we're after. We're an army that's out to win, and win 100% of the time. We're not perfect, but we're sure gonna do a really good job when we do it, and our leaders are the absolute core or center of all that. So not only tells us what right looks like, but it also reinforces, I think, that the Army is a learning organization, that we are not static in our understanding of leadership and how it's applied, but we're also making the best we can data-driven decisions, and data not in the sense of statistics, but in terms of data of what we've learned from all these different sources that Judy talked about. The CAPL, that Army's study on leadership that's done annually, is a longitudinal look at things. So we're taking a look at leaders providing their perception of other leaders from the rank of 05 to 06, as well as our Army civilians across all compos, to try to have a clearer sense of what's going on inside of our formation, because things change. I've been in the Army nearly 30 years, and the Army is the same, but in some ways different than it was when I came in as a second lieutenant a few years ago. So as you touched on before, some of this is a little bit of a departure from our doctrine of 1999 and before. Some of it's more informed in some ways. But I think Judy talked about, and you asked a question about, what can we learn or what has been pulled from other pieces. I think one of the ones that Judy and I have talked about is, hey, listen, we're watching what's going on in Ukraine. We're focused on large-scale combat operations and multi-domain operations. The pace, the tempo, and lethality of that environment is different than I've experienced in my time in the Army. Different than my experiences in Iraq and Afghanistan. And some of those human behaviors and reactions that come down to even the idea of fear is a real thing. So how do leaders prepare to lead formations and teams and to lead through that themselves in that environment? How do we prepare them to be more effective in what we see is going to be the next fight? Rich, any thoughts from you?
No, I think you pretty much got all that. I was thinking as you were talking in terms of the historical experience and how, while some of the details have changed, and certainly the supporting structures become more elaborate, the things that we're asking people to do haven't changed very much. And it relates very closely to, we talk about the three dimensions of an operational environment: the human, the information, and the physical. And we portray that typically by putting the human dimension between the other two, because that's the interface between those things. And your ability to execute or conduct leadership, lead other human beings, is influenced from both directions, right, as well as within that human dimension itself with other people. So I think we're on to something, and I think the direction of the doctrine for developing leaders is very positive.
So it sounds like we've covered quite a bit of the content in the book, and I kind of want to focus on how the book is organized with ADP 622. It was published in 2019, and I'd like you to explain to me kind of how you mesh the content between that book and integrated it with the new FM 622.
Sure. So going back to that, Scott, this ADP 622 gave us the LRM, and so that's the common language. It goes back to that whole common language expectations. What do we need of our leaders? But what's unique is that the FM gives you the how to develop those leaders and gives you the examples and ideas of what you need to do so that you know what right looks like. So as we go through the chapters, we'll kind of outline them just briefly. Chapter 1 kind of gives you those basic tenets for developing our leaders, gives you those leadership requirements, just kind of highlighting the LRM, and then also building teams at an upper handweight level, because we actually have an ATP that focuses on Army team building. So plug for ATP 622.6. So that's chapter 1. And then when you get to chapter 2, it's about the fundamentals developing leaders and units. So we use a 4-prong approach where leaders set conditions, they provide feedback, enhance learning, and create opportunities. And then from there, we also provide leader performance indicators for each attribute and competency. And it's done by developmental needs, strengths, and standard, so that when you go look at it, it's like it gives you those left and right limits of what right looks like. So what are those expectations? And that way you don't have to guess of, well, what is a standard? What is the strength? What is a need?
Yeah, and Chapter 3 really provides some information on what I briefly touched on before, which is that third element of developing or leader development, which is self-development. But that process, just like some of those developmental assessments we talked about before, really starts with identifying a leader's strengths and their developmental needs, and then setting some of those goals, and then creating a plan. And the way that that plan is structured is introduced as DA Form 7906, or the new individual development plan, inside of Chapter 3 of the new FM 622. Most of your listeners, and we all here, are familiar with the idea of an individual development plan. It's not new to the Army. It's already discussed in the current version of ATP 622.1, which is our counseling process, which is also in the midst of a major review. A draft of it is out for staffing across the Army, and we really looked at a lot of your listeners to help us provide a greater framework, providing feedback for folks. And I think Judy's going to touch on it a little bit more. But inside of that ATP, it talks about the 3 types of counselings. And one of those is professional growth counseling. We might call this career counseling, and that's where that IDP is taking that kind of longer look by an individual. What are my goals, not only from a professional standpoint, but maybe a family standpoint? And so 603 for officers and 625 help to structure that. Helps an individual leader to understand, hey, what are those key and developmental assignments? What are those broadening assignments? What are those things that I can do in the middle? If my goal is to reach a certain point in my Army in either my basic branch or a functional area. So again, that IDP helps a leader to grow as they understand more about themselves and to structure their goals towards achieving those goals, but also improving those areas they've identified. Most are already familiar with the IDP because previously there was another version. It's still out there. It's not a DA form. It's in the Army Career Tracker. Some folks are using it. We think this is a better version of it, and the Army is moving to this as the common IDP. Because this new version is more comprehensive and holistic, but it's still a very simple form. But really the power of the IDP is that conversation, that work that the individual leader does to understand more about themselves and to identify goals, but the conversation they need to be having either with a supervisor, a rater, a mentor, as they begin to understand more about themselves and what their goals are for the Army and how they can reach and achieve those goals. Because as leaders, it's our job to help those underneath us to realize their goals as best we can. They may look very different than your career or my career, but that purpose, direction, and motivation should all be aligned about getting the most out of each member of our team as well as ourselves.
I think there's another piece to that, and I know we talk about it, but we don't want people to get the wrong idea, I think, about certain things. The purpose of an IDP is to make you better.
Absolutely.
To make you a better leader. That makes you a more valuable member of the team, and it makes you a better soldier, right? And there's nothing wrong with thinking about IDPs in terms of, hey, it's going to set conditions for me to rise to the level that I think I deserve. But that's really not what our business is about. You know, it's a be all you can be means being the best you can be, and not necessarily individual self-actualization in every case, right? You're going to reach that just by being very good at your job. One of the things we realized as we were working through multi-domain operations as an operational concept and this focus on large-scale combat is we have got to return back to the days where everybody in a particular military occupational specialty or MOS or a branch is considered a subject matter expert in their field. And that subject matter expertise extends to things like coaching and mentoring too, right? Because you can't coach, teach, or mentor something that you don't know what you're talking about. And so there's a demand, and it's a top-down piece, and there's a bottom-up piece to it too. And those light bulbs were coming on, pretty hard over the last couple of years as we were thinking through all the challenges we have as an Army as we return to focusing to a different type of fight.
All right. Those are all very good things. I want to also remember that the 7906 is just a tool to help you figure out where you're going. So I don't want you to think that's the be-all, do-all.
Just a vehicle, yep.
And that's not the whole focus of FM 622 either. So when you're looking at Chapter 4, if you're looking at the actual FM, Chapter 4 is really the bulk of the book. It's the how-to. And so that's, if you want to talk about the meat and potatoes, that's it. So when we talk about each attribute and competency, there are 75 supporting behaviors broken out over the attributes and competencies, and within those, that's how we have like a table for each one. If you go through those behaviors, and it's broken out by strengths and needs, if there are underlying causes to be of concern, and then it breaks it out by feedback, focus study, and practice. And those are the ways to improve those behaviors based on where you are. You don't have to go through them like, this is the first one, this is the second one. You can flip through it as you need it, because it really is there to help leaders and subordinates figure out, how do I get better at doing this? How do I get better at this part of my job? And so that's why the focus of the book really is Chapter 4. So.
No, Judy, I think you're right. And again, as I kind of referred to before, Chapter 4 in some ways, whether you have access to physical assessments, it itself can be used as a form of self-assessment as you go through each of those behaviors. And it provides you what's considered a strength and what's considered a need in each of those. So it's a great way for us to look at it, both whether it's introspective for ourselves or whether it's for one of our leaders to help to describe what a strength is in each of those areas. And then as you talked about is finding some ways and some strategies and tools and products to help move that needle in those areas that that you feel that, hey, I do want to get better. I want to help someone that I work with get better at.
When did we stop? And I know it was probably in the last 15 years or so, but I was just curious. When did we stop going? We always used to talk about strengths and weaknesses, and now we talk about needs. What was the thinking behind that?
A lot of it deals with the psychology of language, if you will. And I know it's part of the psychological evaluations that it went from weaknesses to needs, that needs are a more positive approach to it, so to speak, than just saying, you have a weakness. No, you have a need. So I don't know an exact date or time, but I just know that's kind of the evolution of the psychology and language.
Okay.
And I think whether it's a need or a weakness too, I think it's important, just like the concept of counterproductive leadership. We all exhibit some of those tendencies from time to time. We all have things that we can get better at. And that's part of that, to me at least, that self-actualization, that self-awareness, that we all have these. And I think it's really important, especially those of us that are maybe been in the Army a little bit longer, that leaders share with those that they work with and acknowledge that they have things that they want to work on, the things they're working on. Because, part of this is being honest with ourselves and others. Because, the job of a leader or commander is to make an assessment of those they work with, to help them get better. If there is a two-way conversation and there's already some understanding from the individual looking to get better, I think it will just speed that process, and then I think it'll move that relationship more towards commitment and less about I'm trying to evaluate you, and it's about something that may get me promoted or not getting promoted. Because I think it's back to what you said, Rich. It's all about making leaders better.
Yeah, and so the Army is a team sport, right? And when you're in units, you're in teams. And so you've got subordinates, you've got peers, you've got superiors. And understanding, I think, strengths and needs allows you to complement and reinforce each other in useful ways. The bottom line is everybody's not going to be the same. We're all individual human beings, and we all have things we do better than other things, no matter how hard we try. But when we're honest about that and we communicate that around, other people can compensate. So that team kind of comes together. And we can match strengths against weaknesses and kind of get better. That's a whole part of team building, right?
And I think, because Scott's going to want us to move along, it's a great segue into Chapter 5. Chapter 5 of FM 622, it provides a bunch of examples and products, but it's really structured around how to structure and develop a unit leader development program. And that's about the individual, but it's really about what you're getting after, Rich. It's about the team. And so those products that are pulled from across the Army, but they integrate shared knowledge from not only the Army, but sister services and even the business world. And again, that's all once again grounded in a systemic and scientific research. So we can validate that these are successful ways of helping to ensure that we have mission success. But FM 622 incorporates not only doctrine, but real-world experiences from leaders. So some of those tools and products in there are designed to help someone else to develop their unit leader development program based on the successes, best practices of others. But what I think is key, at least for me, to remember about these programs, as it is about the team, but each part of our team needs sometimes different things. We all have strengths and developmental needs, just like some parts of our organization need work in one area while another may need work in another area. And these programs that are designed and should be structured to help the whole team get better, as well as the individual parts. So if you didn't know, because I didn't know when I came to this job 3 years ago, there's a whole handbook on top of this chapter that helps leaders, and that's primarily probably at the battalion, the brigade level, to develop and structure a unit leader development program. And I think the last key point I would say is this: is that sometimes a leader development program is thought of a stovepipe or something separate from our unit training plan. It's not. They should be nested at every point of contact or every engagement between leaders and teams, because they're all opportunities for individuals and teams to get better.
And you and I have talked about this. Man, we haven't even done it in a podcast at one point, but we discussed this idea that you set expectations correctly, right? So when you're the commander, you're the leader, you're the first sergeant or whatever, your interactions with your subordinates in particular, sometimes I'm encouraging, sometimes I'm coaching, sometimes I'm correcting. But every time we interact, that's a leader development opportunity. If we don't set those expectations so that they've got that geared, and the expectation is, well, we're going to sit down over a table, with 2 chairs, and I'm going to develop you. That's not the expectation you would ever, and the doctrine does not do that at all. I'm just saying, it is unbelievable how common it is when I counsel people when they show up in our organization for the first time, and you ask them when the last time they were counseled, right? Have you ever been counseled? Tell me about leader development programs in your formations. When we were doing the pre-command course, BCAP, the battalion command assessment program, counseling with people that were here, and you would have those discussions with them. And it was really a little bit disappointing sometimes at the degree that people didn't understand they had never been coached or mentored to get to that point.
So there's one thing I want to build on. So the whole genesis of this lineage, if you will, of FM 622 as being a leader development document stems back from CAPL. And, like I said, Colonel Saine said it was a longitudinal study, so it started in 2005, give or take. When General Brown was the CG of CAC, about 2014 timeframe, he's like, look, for 10 years, we're showing that developing leaders is our worst rated competency. It's always the bottom. For civilians, military, didn't matter. And the attitude was sort of like, why? Well, there's not a single one, but the kind of overarching part was, well, PME is that. No, everything you do is leader development. And I think that's what we try to bring out in FM 622 is that everything you do is leader development. Just like everything you do. You just can't let it go going, oh, I'm just going to go to school and be done. No, it's everything you do. So just wanted to make that more clear.
Okay, so it sounds kind of like you're talking about the fundamentals of development to me. And I really think, since we breached this topic, I think we can go ahead and get into it. Can you explain to me how FM 622 really gets after the counseling versus coaching versus mentoring conversation?
Yeah, sure, Scott. So ADP 622 and FM 622, while they introduce and kind of provide a foundation for the importance of feedback, and they describe counseling, coaching, and mentoring, they don't really give you the how-to, and they don't go into any great depth. So currently, ATP 622.1 is the counseling process. But because of really the success of Project Athena and the interest in more coaching, and also along with BCAP and CCAP, and getting more information about self-awareness, we're rewriting ATP 622.1 to become providing feedback, and it's sort of subtitled Counseling, Coaching, and Mentoring. And so we really go into those feedback processes and really give that detailed how-to on each one. I mean, there's a dedicated chapter on counseling, a dedicated chapter on coaching, dedicated chapter on mentoring, so that when that is in your hands, you can actually go through it going, I'm not comfortable doing this, how do I do it? And it walks you through the process, gives you examples, trying to get you set so that you're not, oh, I don't know how to do that. So we're trying to make it that you have a resource there. It's really to help make it more clear for all leaders, because you don't get a background just because you're a new leader doesn't mean you automatically know how to counsel or coach or mentor. So we've got to get it somewhere. Sometimes you have leaders that do that for you, and you've had that experience, but a lot of times we don't. So we want to make sure that we provide that as a resource, just so you can have effective conversations in your units. That's really what it's all about. Is conversations, communication, and getting that feedback. So like I said, it's a major rewrite. It's actually, the initial draft is actually out worldwide staffing this week, goes through May, and then we'll have another turn later this summer. But it's coming. I just need your input.
Yeah, no, Judy, and again, I think you hit some of the really key points, and whether it was necessary or not, I'd just like to reinforce them. It's that, as you said, and I think we'd all agree, the studies, a number of studies tell us what you already said, and you said the CAPL does, is with this idea of providing feedback, coaching, counseling, mentoring is something that we as an institution need to get better at. It helps us to retain quality leaders. It helps to provide feedback and to grow better leaders. It helps to build cohesion in organizations. And the basic concept is, like you just said, it's just about having a conversation. And not a one-way conversation, but ideally, a two-way conversation where we're meeting that other soldier, that other leader, where they are. But sometimes that's a lot harder for others it's harder for some than it is others. It takes practice. It really does. It takes practice in screwing it up sometimes. When Second Lieutenant Saine started the first time in 1994 doing it, I had a great non-commissioned officer that was very patient with me, but also helped guide me to have a more effective conversation. It was a counseling session, but it was a conversation. It helped to build on our relationship, but also to provide frank, candid feedback two ways. Because there's the leadership piece we're talking about, but there's also that leading up. There's some folks that are in our formations that sometimes can help us better see ourselves as well as those things that we're just missing about our organization. So again, that practice is so critical in engaging with our teams and each and every member who each has their own strengths. And like Rich, as you talked about before, it's all about making the team better and helping those with strengths cover others who may have those as developmental needs, and vice versa, and making a stronger overall team. But again, that engagement makes individuals and teams more effective. And then I believe that it can build leaders that have higher levels of trust and commitment, not only in each other, but in the Army. And that is critical to mission success and mission accomplishment, especially in the intense environment we're talking about with large-scale combat. The other thing is, as a topic, and you touched on it, Judy, coaching. It's one of the ways that we define in the ADP how we provide feedback. But you're right. When we started Athena, coaching was one of the elements of that program, and still is. But many of our younger leaders, our small group leaders and instructors, really struggle with the idea. They felt they weren't prepared to have this conversation that's called coaching. But coaching comes in many forms, and they always, I think, lean towards what we might call executive coaching. And that does go on in the Army. The Army uses that as a part of the command assessment program. As candidates complete that process, they have an opportunity to spend some time with a coach, an executive coach that helps them, whether they got selected for command and they don't know it yet, or didn't get selected for command, to understand more about themselves and use that experience to become a better leader in the Army. The Army's also launched through the Talent Management Task Force, the Army Coaching Program. It's in its earlier phases, but it's beginning to grow more and more steam. And again, that's all helping the Army to structure a way to to connect leaders with others who are looking for another opportunity to learn more about themselves and to be given feedback. And then finally, I think what's sometimes lost on people, and Rich, I think you talked about this, coaching goes on every day. It goes on every day and inside of every one of our formation, whether that's in the motor pool, in the field, in the arms room, at PT, or on the range. But all those forms of coaching that I've described there require a leader to do what our doctrine tells us to do. That's to be engaged. To be engaged and provide feedback, and then provide, once again, that direction and motivation to get better. So over time, as a part of Athena and other things, we've developed some tools, a coaching guide and a coaching card, a number of things. And those are those things that I think, Judy, you're talking about. They're going to get pulled in the ATP, and they're really going to hopefully frame and provide some how-tos and some tools to the force to get after, I think, what sometimes is a more effective way of providing feedback than simply just what we think of as traditional counseling.
Yeah, I haven't had a chance to look at ATP 622.1 yet since it just went out, but I'm going to give it a peek. But I'm curious, based on what's in it right now. I always looked at coaching as not a voluntary arrangement. Coaching is a requirement of your duty position. If you're a leader, then you are required to coach your subordinates, because I'm not sure how else you develop them, right? You train them. Part of training is coaching, right? This is where that training and leader development come together, right? Is through coaching. So if you think about sports, you have position coaches, right? You got batting coaches and pitching coaches in baseball. In football, you got all kinds of different flavors. But that ability to coach comes from a significant body of knowledge and some level of experience doing the task that you're coaching people to do, right? And you have to have that to have that sense of authority where you can speak confidently to someone and say, hey, Private Creed, we need to work on this. All right, do this for me again. All right, now stop. We got to work our way through that. And sometimes I think, particularly in units, in the operational force, I'm not sure everybody realizes that that's actually a form of coaching. You're doing training, but you're actually coaching, right? And your ability to do that, your sense of legitimacy, your confidence in being able to do that comes from being able to do those things yourselves. And that links back to a whole bunch of other leader doctrine, right, that we have out there about 2 levels up and 2 levels down and those kinds of things. I just think it's pretty interesting. Whereas when I think about mentoring, that's a two-way voluntary relationship, right? And typically you don't conduct mentorship within the unit while you're serving together at the same time. That's a long-term professional relationship that is voluntary between both parties, that's initiated, could be initiated from either direction. You kind of have to have personalities that mesh, and you kind of have to trust each other to look out for each other in that sense. And I think a lot of people conflate the two, that they think, well, I don't have a mentor. Well, I don't know. Maybe you do. Let's talk about what mentorship is. And then do you have somebody that you can reach out to after time? You and I have talked about this, and Judy and I have as well. If you're somebody that's been in the Army 20 or 30 years and nobody ever calls you, nobody who ever used to work for you ever checks in and says, hey, sir or ma'am, I'm thinking about going to do this, and I'm really interested in what you think, or I got to get ready for this next board. Can you take a look at my file? Those kinds of things. If no one ever reaches out to you, you probably haven't been doing something right.
Rich, I think on this whole thing, whether it's mentorship or coaching, I think what can't be lost on all of us, this comes down, and you're talking about it, it's human interaction, it's interpersonal skills. And it's so important that that's a two-way street. Is that just the way I deliver the message is just as important as the person being delivered to is receptive to that feedback. I find myself all the time with my 12 and 13-year-old boys that they are not receptive to feedback. But I also have to acknowledge that part of the reason they may not be receptive to feedback at that moment in time is because I haven't created the conditions. I haven't behaved or provided the information in a way that helps them to become receptive. That it's not an I gotcha moment. It's a I'm here to help you get better because I want us to get better. And I think if we think of it through some of that lens, sometimes it'll help everyone, both the one providing the feedback and the one receiving it, to understand that this is about the team. It's about the team getting better, and you're a key part of that team, no matter what your job is, whether you're E1 private or you're the BCT commander.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more, sir. So, as the lowest ranking person in this room right now, I can tell you, I want to be coached, I want to be mentored, and I want the counseling. I think it's vital to a lot of us with our growth. Likewise, though, there's often a lot of times I have to look in the mirror and consider my own self-development. So, I'm going to make a shameless plug here for the Military Review magazine. Their March edition this year started with an article from Colonel Schmidt, the director of Army University Press, and he opened the magazine with an article called Read Like Your Life Depends on It and the Lives of Your Soldiers Depend on It. And I couldn't say there's a better title for an article that says, hey, you need to develop yourself. And I consider reading a very important part of that. It helped me grow as a leader, a husband, and a father. And I just love that he opened the magazine with that. So as we talk about self-development, can you talk to me more about how FM 622 covers the phases of self-development?
Sure. So Scott, we mentioned earlier, as we did the outline, that Chapter 3 is kind of the bulk of self-development. That's its whole focus. So it walks you through the process, sort of step by step. How do you determine strengths? How do you figure out your needs? How do you set goals? How do you figure out, that self-directed learning part, like reading on your own? Where do you get that motivation? How do you figure out the methods? How do you figure out, is this the right content? So we kind of walk you through all of that. And we also tell you that, part as a companion to reading, journaling. It helps you process, what did I read? What did I take away from it? What are those great ideas? And then stepping back into the phases, once again, setting milestones. Where do I want to be in 6 months? Where do I want to be in 9 months? Whatever it is, or 2 years, 5 years. Because you got to build momentum. Okay, you just can't start and say, I'm done, took this first step. And then as you build that momentum and you work through the phases, how do you assess your progress? Am I making, where I need to be? Do I need to adjust my goal? Maybe I need to adjust what I'm doing or how I'm doing it. So that's really the bulk of Chapter 3. It's all about self-development. And we mentioned before, Chapter 4, it provides all of those developmental activities for all the different behaviors. And so you can use that also to walk through the process of how do I stack up on this particular behavior? Maybe as you read through it, you're going, I think I'm pretty good at whatever this one is. Maybe builds trust. And as you read through it, you're going, oh, maybe I'm not as strong in that area as I thought. Well, here's some ideas of what I can do to study or get feedback on to help myself improve in that area. So Chapter 3 and 4 are kind of linked in that regard because it's there to provide that information. I think that's the biggest thing there is that that self-assess and figure out where you need to go in your whole personal development.
Don't you notice that there's that human piece, and we've all had it with subordinates in the past. Sometimes you have it with peers. Sometimes you have it with bosses every once in a while too, right? But somebody will say, "Hey, so what do you think about something?" And you say, "Well, if I were you, I would work on these things." And they're like, "Uh-huh." And then you find out later they went and talked to like 15 other people because the answer you gave them involved work, right? And they were looking for a magic pill, as if there's some magic pill that's going to make you smarter or all of a sudden a great leader of soldiers. And so once you get people to get past that, to understand that it's going to take a little bit of work, a little bit of self-application, particularly when you get ready to move into new jobs, you probably want to do some research on that before you show up. Whatever that might look like for your particular specialty or that duty position, right? And that's where that coaching and mentoring all of a sudden comes back into play. Do I have somebody I can call to say, hey, I'm getting ready to go be a battalion S3, and I've never done that before? That's probably a bad example. How about a brigade S3, right? So I've been a battalion S3, but brigade's a little bit different. So who do I talk to say, hey, tell me what I need to know to be really good at this so I'm not trying to catch up all the time?
Well, I think that's one of the things, it's not a magic pill, but I do think one of the things about FM 622 is at least it gives you a starting place. Because a lot of times you have no idea. I know I need to work on something. What do I need to work on? And how do I do it? And I think that's the case for a lot of younger leaders, especially brand new sergeants. Do they know how to coach and counsel? Maybe, maybe not. Maybe they've had good leaders that did that for them, but oftentimes that's not the case. So this is kind of the focus of why Chapter 3 and 4 are built the way they are. It is to give you that starting point. It may not be the absolute answer, but it gets you on the right path. And if nothing else, it gets you thinking about where you need to go.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that reading part, the point that you put out in Colonel Schmidt's article in Military Review, particularly with the direction the Army's going and the types of conflicts that we might be expected to prosecute on the nation's behalf, because if you don't have experience with something, then you need to read about other people's experience. In that case, because if you can learn from previous experience, that's a level of self-development that shouldn't just be the purview of history nerds, right?
So the next topic is kind of a big one. We sort of touched about teams already. So leadership development programs, your LPDs, your OPDs, your NCOPDs, and I got to know from the group what makes a good leader development program, and how does 622 align with FM 70 to help with that leadership program?
So Chapter 5 of FM 622, Scott, does kind of talk a little bit about that, and we give you some basic elements of things that it should include. But really, when a unit commander is sitting there, or a unit leader, even just whatever level, you got to figure out what is the purpose and the applicability. That's where you have to start. Figure, why am I doing it? What do we need to know? And then from there, you really should be nesting it with your overall training plan. Because if you're stovepiping it and like, okay, well, if we're training the 6 lanes on this and a warfighter on this, your leader development program should be supporting those things. It shouldn't be something taking a complete left turn and going, maybe we need to prepare for a deployment, so we're not going to give you information on, I don't know, offhand. It's just, got to keep them nested. They have to be topics that are, interrelated. And that builds success.
No, and Judy, we talked about this a little bit before, and Rich, we did too. It's every activity we have it is an opportunity for an individual or a team to get better. I think sometimes, we talked about some of the assessments before, and assessments aren't necessarily a new thing in the Army. Each of us from a different branch or MOS, we have a unique set of skills and competencies we must have, and that's normally in some type of certification or qualification. Whether that's a tank table or a fire sport table or whatever it is, it defines how we should perform things, the task, condition, standard, and we've all worked towards that. But as a part of the leader development programs, a lot of these things that we're talking about are not as binary as, say, how do I get better on an Army combat fitness test? If I run 11-minute, 30-second 2-mile, and that's not me anymore. I don't think it ever was. But I only deadlift 130 pounds. I very clearly know what I need to work on. some of these other things we're talking about, interpersonal skills, my ability to build trust in my organization, my ability to build teams, to build a positive environment, those are much more, maybe some might say, squishy. But these assessments are one way that we can get some feedback to work towards these things. So with that comes that self-awareness piece. But those types of skills are just as, if not more important, when it comes to leading and building a cohesive team. And so working those things into that unit leader development program, as well as into our own maybe IDP if we have one, our old plan to get better, is something that we have to look at each phase of our career. Because just like the assessments that are being introduced in PME, those developmental assessments, they're progressive and sequential. So they get more difficult and complex, just like what the Army expects of us as we move up through the ranks, whether it's to sergeant to staff sergeant, going from a team leader to squad leader, or whether it's the battalion S3 to the brigade S3. Each of those steps is an opportunity to learn and grow, but it also requires us to be reflective and then seek feedback from other people to find out what are those knowledge, skills, and behaviors, those competencies and attributes that are important for success. And that may look different for one leader than another leader, because we're all unique individuals. We're all a part of a larger team. But again, all I could go back to is that every interaction is an opportunity. And so, LPDs, OPDs, NCOPDs, range briefs to the battalion S3 or battalion commander, lieutenant certification programs, a whole host of great ideas that are out throughout the force are all just a part of that training, that leader development program. But really, it's a part of unit training program too, because making a junior leader better at leading their teams is going to make them better at all those technical skills too, because it's a team sport, like Rich said.
I'll tell you, one of my great frustrations, 32 years in the Army and then the last few years as a civilian, is how many people talk about leader development programs and how few actually implement them, right? And so everyone's comfortable talking about it, and then, if you start asking leading questions about, so what does your program look like? Well, we're thinking about doing this. And so I made that a focus of the pre-command course counseling sessions. And I think the very notion of a positive command climate stems from having a leader development program that is consistent and is both broad and specific, right? And so when we talk to our subordinates, whatever the topics are that you're choosing, I've always found it useful to alternate between very specific topics, skills, right, necessary. How do I do a call for fire, develop an engagement area, command supply discipline, those kinds of things, right, or maintenance operations, right? So those are very specific things. But you want to alternate them from time to time with broad topics that talk about the profession and what we expect leaders to do, what have leaders had to do in the past, and have those kinds of discussions. Because what I found is when you alternate that, along with some sort of team building things like officer sports or NCO sports, once a week, you do two things. One, you're helping to develop future leaders, not just for their current job, but for greater levels of responsibility in the past. And then they are learning about you because you're personally engaged with them and you're facilitating a discussion. So when someone says they do a leader development program and then it's only, somebody else leading the discussion as opposed to the senior leader in the room, that's not really your program. It's okay for them to set it up, but you should be central to whatever that session is, sharing your experiences, sharing lessons learned the hard way or the easy way throughout your career. So they're learning about you, but you're also learning about them, right? So you always get snapshots of your subordinates, and oftentimes your vision of a subordinate is the time you caught them doing something the wrong way, right? And so you may have this view of Lieutenant X as being kind of a dummy. And then all of a sudden you get into the room and you've got all the officers in the battalion sitting around in a conference room like this, and you're discussing the aspects of this kind of war or gates of fire or some fictional thing, and Starship Troopers, because you wanted to give them something light, and let's talk about something that's very broad, right? And all of a sudden, somebody that you thought was kind of slow you realize they're extremely clever, very intelligent, that they're deep thinkers, that they've done that. And that sports piece with the officers, same thing. You learn about personality types, you learn about all kinds of things. And they're, again, learning about you. And it's that personal engagement that takes place. And it takes, probably an hour a week, and it's probably 2 or 3 hours a month to do that. But if you make the time to do that, and everybody knows that it's coming, it's amazing. People, at first, they're moaning and groaning about it. I'd rather be doing something else. We've got other things to do. As soon as you do it, after you do it for a couple of months, everybody's excited. Like, they want to show up. They want to have a conversation because they want to be heard, but they also want to hear what you have to say.
Well, I think it's a great point, Rich, too, is you to me at least, just the idea that you brought out, which is you made this an emphasis. You made this a priority in your organization. And I think the other thing that maybe didn't come clear to everybody is that, those activities you talked about have desired outcomes you as the leader. It's not just, hey, we're playing team sports or we're going to discuss a book we read. It's an opportunity to engage with your team, but it's an opportunity to assess them. And not assess them in an A versus F, but to know them in a better way. And I think that's sometimes maybe what we don't always do well, which is in some of these activities, think about what are the outcomes I'd like to get out of this. And in the same way, when we do unit training, we're always a lot of times focused in an AAR afterwards of what went well, what went poorly, how can we get better, and very technically focused. And I think sometimes we miss an opportunity to discuss this idea of leadership. How did leadership behave through this table? How did this leadership behave through this exercise? Where was it helpful? Where was it not? And I'm talking bigger than just decision making. And I think the other thing is how did the team behave? I mean, there's organizations that may have hit every training gate and performed well at every one, but if their climate or their cohesion isn't strong, when they hit a crucible or they hit things that become more difficult
or new,
yeah. Then there's a tendency by some to then no longer be that high performer and maybe even crumble. Or that's why that human aspect of us seeing each other as a team and working together and want the best for each other is so important. But I think missed sometimes because it's not definable in terms of a minute and a second or a degree of accuracy or precision.
Well, we're kind of getting near the end of this, so I have a couple of fun questions and time for some shameless plugs from the FM 622 team. So I got to ask, what makes FM 622 different from the average leadership book you can pick up from Barnes & Noble?
All right, first off, Scott, my gut reaction is to tell you it's free, okay? All right, but seriously, it's geared to what Army leaders need. And it's tested, it's real life, what works for Army leaders, but it's flexible enough that it can apply to any organization or any industry out there. It's got universal concepts, and we just tell you how to make it work. And of course, by it being an Army product, we also have lots of supporting products for it. So if you come to the website, you'll find all kinds of things like the Command Climate Navigator, our LPDs in a box, that kind of take away those leadership topics and kind of give you a structured way to get at them. So it isn't just the book once and done, it's a book plus support. And you can reach out to us.
Yeah, and Scott, I would tell you that if you look at most of those books, and I read a lot of them too, so I just don't sit around all day and read FM 622. I know that's a shock to Judy. But all those books, if you take them, you take the concepts in them, whether they have some fancy term or phrase that makes it recognizable on the shelves of Barnes & Noble, is that I bet you most, if not all, that stuff in those books fit in the LRM. Because, like Judy said, everything in the LRM is specific to our profession. It's been tested, it's been studied, but it's not necessarily unique. It's just the expectation in our profession is that all leaders, no matter what rank, are putting this together. We're all better at some things and not as strong at other things, but it's all about working towards being the best version of ourselves and being all we can be. I think the other thing we can't forget is that leadership is a competitive advantage that the United States Army has against our adversaries. Our adversaries across the world envy but cannot replicate what we have. And although that we have some very professional officers and we have professional warrant officers and Army civilians, I would tell you that in my experience, our non-commissioned officer corps is what sets us apart. It set us apart for for decades, if not centuries, and it will continue to, because our non-commissioned officers, which make up the weight of our leaders in the Army, are the ones that are where the rubber meets the road. They are the ones that like Rich said before, are coaching, are training young soldiers in their teams every single day. So we need to do, as more senior leaders, everything possible to support them. To support them and enable them to do the best possible job, because in the end, it's going to, when metal meets metal somewhere around the world, it's going to come down to a squad leader, a platoon sergeant, making split-second decisions that are going to mean the life or death of some young man or woman.
Yeah, I think the Nike saying of "just do it." At some point, we can lead people to the water of doctrine. We can lead to them the water of all the different products and programs out there. But at some point, it's an individual responsibility to just do it. And to pile on to Sam's point, in the current FM30, we changed our combat power model. And I'm not going to get into the details of it, but one of the qualitative difference between like types of units, whether they're friendly or enemy, is the leadership. That's a qualitative difference in combat power between the same types of units. And everybody has been in the Army long enough, if they're listening to this podcast, to have walked into the exact same type of units. So you're in a brigade, you go to one infantry company, you go to a different infantry company, or one tank company, or another tank company. They're identically organized, identically manned, and yet the atmospherics and the climate in those are different. They have a different feel. And why is it that they feel different? I would argue it's the differences in leadership. And it's not all good or bad, but they're different, right? And again, it drives you back to that human dimension of our business, of which this is probably the most important.
So I think everyone's answer around this room should be FM 622 or the 622 series to this next question. But I got to know, what is your favorite leadership book or books, and what websites do you frequently visit that deal with leadership?
Okay, I guess I'll start. And I'll admit it right here between Mr. Creed and Miss Price. I'm the least well-read of the three. But listen, this is something that I did not start off my career. I started off reading a lot of FMs and doctrine because I felt I needed to create a baseline. But I think reading is so critically important. And I think Rich was talking about this. There was a famous poet at one point that said, "Yet history may not repeat itself, but it sure does rhyme." And so I think the more we can add to our kit bag, the better we are postured to be able to lead as effectively as possible in any given situation. Listen, I'm not going to name anybody specific. There's a ton of great podcasts out there today that are a real change from when I came in the Army. It's a really great way in a short time to learn a bunch from other people. I think biographies, reading about economics, geopolitics, international relations, foreign affairs, human character, human behavior, group dynamics are all important to who we are. But I think the biggest thing is that like myself, and I think the first book that I read in sometime early in high school that really took off was, I think it was a Tom Clancy book, a Red Storm Rising. It was, that was back to Cold War days. But it really, it defined equipment and all kinds of things. I think the key is really finding what you enjoy reading, and then just getting after it and reading it and discussing and sharing with others. And again, like I said, as you read, whether it's something old or new, try to read with a critical eye or ear. Question, pull threads, challenge your own biases. I think it will expand how you think, both critically and creatively, and it will allow you to provide maybe a greater diversity of thought as a part of a team. And I think that's what makes our teams so incredibly strong in our Army, because folks come from all walks of life, all backgrounds, and we've got to pull that from each of them, because they may not feel it's important, but it so is, and reading is a great place to start. But in the end, this is all about being better postured, like I said before, to be able to understand and apply and decide when time is short and conditions are complex in a situation. In a lot of cases in our business, let's face it, there's probably somebody on the other end who wants to kill us and our friends. And so the more we can do before game time, I think that the better we're ready to meet that challenge head on.
Oh, you want me? Okay. So, Sam, I think hit it all. I think biographies, both military and political, for me, they were personally appealing because I'm interested in both of those things. And the neat thing about that is you can pick somebody you think you're going to like, and you might learn something about them, and you're like, well, they probably weren't, it wasn't as easy. And I stay away from autobiographies. It's not that they're not interesting, but I want something that stood the test of time, and it's not something that's released without a lot of historical context. Military history obviously is a no-brainer, but I think the part I would add is it doesn't make any difference what epoch or era. If you're interested in the Romans, or you're interested in the Middle Ages, you're interested in World War I or the U.S. Civil War, or whatever, it doesn't really matter because the human aspects of that are unchanged, and the same kinds of issues typically adjusted for technology or historical context, it hasn't changed much. The other is that useful fiction that you were talking about. And the reason why, to me, useful fiction is really powerful, and I would include science fiction in that as well, is because it tends to take an idealized view. So you've got characters that get everything right. You've got characters who are flawed. You've got characters who are super bad guys, but even then they'll have some, if it's well done, redeeming qualities. And that kind of helps you see the world in an informed way, because even though it's fiction, those authors base the fiction on real world examples. They're not just making it up out of their head. And then I think I have a couple particularly favorite series of books, and one's relatively recent, the last 20, 30 years, the Rifleman series, about the Napoleonic era. Typically starts with small units, but it ends up in the series large units. And then anything by C.S. Forester. So he wrote the Hornblower series. It's naval fiction, but it is the development of a single leader over the course of a 30-year career. And it's very well written, it's easy to do, but his other books touch on similar themes.
So I want to say yes, all of the above on the broad topics, the nonfiction, the technical stuff, but I definitely want to put a plug in for novels, because novels are about relationships with people, and leadership is all about relationships with people. And the other thing about novels is that they give you that step back to say, what if? What if I was in that situation? I may not do it the way that character did it, but it makes you think through it. And as a leader, you can't think through every situation in advance, but a novel often gives you that chance to do that thinking without harming anyone. And so reading those novels, and I've had folks that are like, well, novels are a waste of my time, they're not worth it, you got to stick with the biography, you got to stick with the history. No, really, novels have their place, and they're necessary because they are other people, and it's all about what if. And that's what leadership is. What am I going to do? What are you going to do, Lieutenant? What are you going to do, Sergeant? What are you going to do? And the novels give you that ability to think through it in advance. So read everything, read anything. Just read and think about it. That's my big plug.
Spot on.
Gentlemen, ma'am, thank you so much for the insight today, and thank you for your continued stewardship of our Army. It's been a lovely time sitting here talking with you all and getting your insights into developing leadership. In preparing for this episode, most of my questions emerged from getting reacquainted with some current manuals, specifically ADP 1, the Army, ADP 6-22, Leadership in the Profession, and FM 622, Developing Leaders. There are some older books I was looking at as I was doing my research as well, to include FM 22-100 from 1999, which is Army Leadership, Be, Know, Do. FM 622 from 2006, which is Army Leadership, Competent, Confident, and Agile. And then the previous version of FM 622, Leader Development from 2015. As always, the current books are available for download on the Army Publishing Directorate website. My internet browser bookmarks include numerous leadership websites to include From the Green Notebook, 3x5 Leadership Shelf, Military Review, War on the Rocks, and the Harvard Business Review. A quick trip to your local bookstore or a search on Google will find you a plethora of leadership books and articles. But in the meantime, I will inundate you with a list of some of my favorites. The 21 Laws of Irrefutable Leadership by John C. Maxwell, Defeat into Victory, it's Field Marshal Viscount Slim's autobiography. Extreme Ownership and the Dichotomy of Leadership are by Jocko Willink and Leif Babin. Game Changers by Mike Lupica. And then Asking the Right Questions, A Guide to Critical Thinking by Neil M. Brown. We'd like to thank all of our listeners for joining us today. Our production is coordinated by Mr. Ted Crisco, and our editing and sound is provided by Captain Wyatt Harper. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe on either Apple or Google Podcasts for new episodes. You can also follow us on Facebook and Twitter at U.S. Army Doctrine for updates from the Combined Arms Doctrine Directorate, as well as our Doctrine Digest videos, audiobooks, and most importantly, new doctrine. Finally, the views and opinions expressed in this podcast do not necessarily reflect the official position of the United States Army, the U.S. Army Training and Doctrine Command, or the Combined Arms Center. I'm Captain Scott Jones, and this has been Breaking Doctrine.